Hey guys, sorry I can't be there. I would much rather be there with you than in a very long all-day meeting. In an effort to try to make things a little easier on you, I'm going to do some fairly short notes. It's going to be the second half of the C.4 Conservation and Biodiversity presentation. The first half is teaching you about Simpson's Biodiversity Index, and I would much rather be there in person to go over that with you. So this is going to be the second half, equally important, but not so necessary for me to actually be present and make sure you're actually paying attention. So we're going to start with in situ conservation. So please remember that in situ means in the field. Ex situ means you are removing whatever you're studying and studying it in the lab. So in situ conservation is conservation in the field, and how basically it requires management of these nature reserves and national parks. I want you to think about if you've ever been to a nature reserve. Basically, there's huge benefits for nature reserves. One, because we have so much control within the borders, we can control invasive species. We can more easily control human exploitation, no poaching in this case. Lots of endangered species can be protected. We've got a very cool place for research, in situ research, and we can restore some degraded areas. Lots of different examples all over the world, even here in Florida. We've got quite a few here in Indonesia as well. And they can be privately owned, though most are national and protected by law. Now, what we're going to talk about is basically the edge effect. The effect of what happens on the edge of these nature reserves and why it may be important to have them be a specific shape. So I'm going to ask you a series of questions, and I'd like for you to answer them. The video is going to pause and the question's going to pop up. But basically, we have different options. We have option 1 or option 2. If you had to pick as your nature reserve, would you rather have the option on the top or the option on the bottom? Okay. Moving on, would you rather have the option on the top here or this bottom one or this one? So this first one, I just want you to compare the top box to the bottom box. Which would you rather have? Now, I'd like for you to look within just this box. If you had to choose just one, would you have them on the left, or would you have it look more like the one on the right? Okay, now let's say that we're going to just compare this top box here with this bottom box for starters. Would you rather have your nature reserve look like the options found in the top or in the bottom? Now, within this box, which would you rather have? This one on the left or this one on the right? And within this box, would you rather have this one on the left or this one on the right? Think about how if you had to design a reserve, or if you only had a specific area you could fit it in, which one would you rather have? And then finally, would you rather have this box on the top, this nature reserve shape on the top, or this one on the bottom? Let me explain some reasons why. So in all the cases, the top portions, the top boxes are always better for the size and shape of a nature reserve than the bottom ones, though something is better than nothing. This first one, larger is better. why would a larger nature reserve be better? So the answer I'm hoping you come up with is there's more room for greater biodiversity if you have a larger nature reserve. Now, this one here, we're going to learn a little bit more about what happens on the edge effect. The less edge you have, the more stable the environment. So in every case, this one here on the top has less edge than either of these two options. Also, you want to have them closer together. So if you have these reserves as close together as possible, this means that the areas that the organisms have to travel between that is not a reserve, there's less distance to travel. So in this case, both of these are better, certainly, than either of these. And if you had to choose between these top two, this one would definitely be the better choice because there's just more. And finally, corridors. Corridors are pretty amazing. They help link up, they're just these small narrow patches that help link up two different reserves, and it's sort of a safe passage. Where I'm from in upstate New York, all the highways actually have corridors built underneath them, so the animals do not have to go over the top of the highway. They can get from one area of the forest to the other without going over the highway. They go under it, and that's a great corridor for them. I'm going to show you other examples of those in a second. So I would like for you to list for me the 4 things that are important, the general principles of nature reserves. You should know these 4. You should have these written down in your notes. Larger, less edge, clustered together, and corridors. Okay, this is kind of going over each piece in part with a little bit more detail. Bigger in this case is better. It's not always the case, but in this case it is. Larger habitats mean more resources, more breeding sites, more niches, more biodiversity, typically more established ecosystems, larger places for the species to hide. Corridors. The corridor effect is extremely beneficial. So there's lots of areas in the world where in farmland we have what's known as green belts or hedgerows, which basically is a natural corridor that helps with migration, foraging. It helps the organisms get from one reserve to the next without necessarily being able to get into the farmer's field. It does allow these animals to move right from one to the other. Without the corridor, the species would be isolated and they wouldn't be able to interbreed, migrate, that kind of thing. When nature reserves are joined with a corridor, they're able to move and have a lot bigger range of environment. They encourage greater biodiversity. It's a big one. Okay, we talked about edge a little bit already. The edge effect, the boundaries between the habitats can basically, they have more disturbance, okay? The disturbance around the edge, and this can be really anything, but really the most disturbance is from humans. It can also be, I guess, less isolation for weather, but really we're really talking about humans in this case. The boundary, the reserves, there's no wall typically. Maybe sometimes there's a fence, but there's lots of disturbance from the outside which goes into the forest. And if the habitat itself is fragmented, the more edges it has, the more disturbance it will have. Disturbance typically decreases biodiversity. There are exceptions, there's always exceptions to the rule in biology, but disturbance typically decreases biodiversity. Some organisms thrive with disturbance, and these are typically invasive species and even in some cases parasites. For example, These cowbirds, they like to forage in open areas, something like this, but they lay their eggs just inside woodlands. So the more edge, the more habitat for cowbirds to basically lay their eggs. Now, I want you to take a look at these two graphs. I want you to pause the video and study them. And then I want you to answer these 4 questions. So, after you have now answered those 4 questions, I'm just gonna hit kind of the high notes. In both cases, what we're looking at here, this top graph is about the abundance of organisms and the distance from the edge. So this is right at the edge, and this is 250 meters in a reserve from the edge. This is richness. So we've got abundance and richness. Richness is essentially biodiversity. So what's happening in both cases is that as we get inside, away from the edge, initially the distance, as we get closer or inside the edge, the richness, the biodiversity is increasing. And so is the abundance of organisms. Now, just inside the edge itself is the lowest for both. And as it increases, or as we get in from the edge, it increases. And then as we get the farthest in, it drops off. The reason for this is the edge effect. So there are lots of organisms that benefit and can do very well with disturbance. But in many cases, when we have too much disturbance, we end up having some organisms hurt. So in this case, 25 meters in, there's a lot of disturbance, and the biodiversity and the abundance falls. As we get further in, it increases in both cases because these areas are being less disturbed, and therefore the organisms can thrive a little bit more. But in this case, what's happening with the drop is they are becoming very stable, and in this case there are some organisms that can just outcompete all the rest, and there's not enough disturbance to knock them all back and even the playing field. Okay. In some instances, humans need to intervene to help with conservation. We need to take active management steps. Some of these include culling out alien or damaging species, that means to kill them, fire clearing to kill invasive species, replanting or reintroducing endangered species, and taking legal measures against human impacts. Make sure that you understand the practices used in actively managing reserves and can illustrate this with a good example. I'm going to give you one in just a second. So take a minute and tell me, what is effective management of a reserve? Here are some great listed ideas of what effective management is. Write these down, make sure that you can list them and describe them. Okay, when we have endangered species, we have to take measures in some cases to save them. We have 2 types of conservation. We have in situ and ex situ conservation. So this is in the field. Read through this list and make sure you understand what's happening with these organisms, why we can conserve them in the field. And then what steps would we have to pull the animals out and try to save them outside of the field? If the habitat is lost, if they do not breed, if they're too rare to breed, that kind of thing. I'm going to come back to this in the next video.